Okay, you are now live, Annette.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you to all of you for joining us, those of you on Facebook and those of you through Zoom. We're so happy to have you. My name is Annette Oltmans. I am the founder and CEO of the Men Project. This is our intensive training for this month. Does it help or does it harm? Facts about couples therapy with an abuser or a narcissist. We will be hosting training intensives monthly through Zoom and Facebook Live. So we'd love for you to stay informed by subscribing to our website or following us on social media. And don't hesitate to share with us topics that you'd like to see us cover, because we love to hear from you and we love your insight. And then we can create a training intensive around your interest points. And I'm sorry I don't have my notifications off. It's making beep sounds. Anyways, the Men Project is a nonprofit organization I founded in 2016 to educate, to equip, and restore all those impacted by abuse. We teach survivors, we teach first responders, therapists, faith-based leaders, and other nonprofits regarding abuse and double abuse. We train them how to understand and identify the complexities of abuse. We try to simplify complicated topics to make it more easy to understand, because abuse can be very complicated. And we teach how to respond to victims and how to interface with abusers in correct ways to prevent re-traumatization and to prevent double abuse. Double abuse is a term that we use that describes the secondary harm that often occurs when a victim reaches out for help, but they are inadvertently and sometimes even intentionally harmed by those whom the victim places their trust. So, for example, victims may not be believed, they may be judged or given incorrect instructions, or they may be criticized and even blamed for the abuse, which is a highly traumatizing experience for them to go through. For a deeper training on these issues, please register for our upcoming introductory training to be held over 2 days next week on February 4th and 5th from 10 o'clock a.m. till noon each day. And details and the link to register can be found on our website at themendproject.com. So today we're excited to speak to you about couples therapy. Is it helpful or is it harmful when there is abuse in a relationship or when you are with a narcissist? Couples therapy is an area in which we see far too many victims of abuse experiencing additional unnecessary harm. Now, we're not saying that therapists are not well-intended, but this is just a problem that occurs prolifically. It's not an isolated issue. It is a common problem. And we want to help you make better decisions about either recommending couples therapy to those that are in your care or to a difficult couple you may be coming alongside, or to know when to steer clear from it. Disclosure, I am not a psychologist. I'm a survivor. I'm a content creator, and I've been conducting qualitative research for years by interviewing hundreds of victims, hundreds of therapists, and hundreds of pastors, as well as researching academic work regarding abuse and trauma. So for the purpose of our time together, I'm not speaking to you as a psychologist, but I have delved deeply into this topic of couples therapy, and I've had my own personal experiences with it. And so I can speak and in my interviews with so many victims and therapists on this topic, I can speak confidently about what we're going to discuss today. I'm going to refer to those people who cause harm, who engage in abusive behaviors, as abusers, just to simplify the conversation, and to those who have experienced harm as victims or survivors. I will also be using the term narcissism at times when speaking about abusers, because they often are commingled, which I'll touch on in a minute. In today's training, we are not offering a PowerPoint, so I recommend that if you're interested in jotting down the high points, that you grab a pencil and paper. Okay, so to begin, narcissism and abuse are often closely positioned together, but not all narcissists are abusers and not all abusers are narcissists. Just to give you a little background, narcissistic personalities fall on a continuum. And the more severe side of that continuum, the less chance there is for change. When someone has been formally tested positively by a professional in psychology or psychiatry as one with narcissistic personality disorder, the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, 5th edition, identifies this as cluster B personality disorder. That's just for your information, but we won't touch on that again in this training. So a narcissistic abuser refers to a person in an interpersonal relationship. So in a close relationship, it could be parent-child, it could be husband-wife, or somebody that you're closely associated with in a work environment, who seeks to gain and maintain power over the other and who has a grandiose sense of self-importance and a sense of entitlement to the relationship. So by definition, a narcissist lacks emotional empathy for others, particularly their intimate partner or somebody that they're very closely associated with. They cannot feel their partner's pain nor their joy. And a classic trait of this persona is that they care about the feelings of those a classic trait of this persona is that they care about the feelings of those they are intimately involved with only if by doing so they are able to gain something for themselves. So it has an ulterior motive if they appear that they care. The focus within the relationship is on themselves. So for example, often narcissists or abusers will pretend to care but it has an ulterior motive, like I said. So they may, by pretending to care, they may win favor with the victim. The victim may lower their boundary or accommodate them in some way, or they may be rewarded and given control over something. They may be supported in having to not have to take responsibility for what they just did, for their abusive and manipulative behaviors. So by pretending to care, the victim, like I said, may remove boundaries or remove consequences and so forth. By pretending to care in public, which they're very good at doing, the abuser may influence others to perceive them in a positive light, even though their actions behind closed doors looks very differently to their partner. And their emotions of care that they're projecting publicly is not rooted in authenticity. So with that in mind, let's talk about couples therapy. In today's unique climate, we're hearing more and more stories about the increase in severity of abuse, even more so as victims are quarantined with their partners for extended periods of time. Many victims don't understand that they are in fact experiencing a form of domestic violence, but they do recognize their need for outside help. Naturally, they turn to couples therapy. In many circumstances, couples therapy can be very beneficial. However, where there is any portion of abuse in a relationship, and especially where the one causing harm is also demonstrating narcissistic behaviors, and not simply learned bad habits, because we all gain bad habits, interpersonal bad habits over our lifespan. But if they are demonstrating narcissistic behaviors, couples therapy is both not useful, but it is actually harmful. So there are times when abusive behaviors may be happening in our relationships. And because like I said, we've all learned bad habits. But for a healthy person, someone who is not pathological in nature, when that abusive behavior is confronted and explained, if the victim says, "That hurts me when you say these things, it causes me to feel this way, you're not hearing me," or however they confront it, when that abusive behavior is confronted and explained, a healthy person will be able to rise above their own defenses, and they will be able to self-reflect without defensiveness, and they will acknowledge the harm they're causing and immediately work to stop it. That's just a natural course of a healthy person. They want to be their best self. They want to grow. They want to improve. So they immediately change. It is not difficult to change. If you take a parenting class and somebody points out to you, this is actually harmful for your child, you're going to immediately stop it. You're not going to want to repeat that behavior, but that's not true for abusers and narcissists. In these scenarios, couples therapy can, when it's a healthy person, can be quite helpful as long as the therapist is willing to confront abusive behaviors. And sadly, that's often not the case. But where an abuser is not merely someone who's developed a few bad habits, but is more entrenched in what we call faulty thinking, they will employ a number of manipulative tactics in therapy that in most cases the therapist is ill-equipped or unwilling. So it could be that they're ill-equipped or they're merely deliberately unwilling to confront. So my intention is to go through a number of these scenarios that are initiated either by the abuser or by the therapist, and unravel them today, because they are intertwined. At times it may seem like I'm skipping around, but my hope is that you will see how interlocked the attitudes of the therapist become with the manipulative behavior of the abuser to create any number of traumatic and chaotic experiences for the victim. So let's begin at looking at a common scenario that plays out when the abuser is confronted or questioned by the victim, or maybe the therapist in a therapeutic setting. If the victim complains about one specific behavior, such as minimization, I'm going to focus on minimization. And minimization is when one person devalues the beliefs or needs of the other person in various ways, but they basically say it's unimportant and they minimize, they devalue it, they put it in a downgraded position. When minimization is confronted then by the victim, the abuser may agree to, in the presence of a therapist, may agree to stop that specific behavior for the time being, but they will switch to employing other defensive and abusive behaviors, making that effort to stop minimization, making it inauthentic. So it's not an authentic gesture or action on their part. It creates now more confusion and chaos because they've employed new defensive behaviors, because their posture is to be defensive and to not own and take responsibility. So for example, if they are minimizing their spouse's needs, they may change to saying, oh, you're too sensitive, or I didn't mean that, I didn't say that. So now the behavior is about blame shifting. The victim's too sensitive. Now the blame is on them for being too sensitive, and they're gaslighting them by saying they never said that or they didn't mean that, when the victim intuitively knows what they experienced and heard. Abusers will say and do just about anything to avoid accountability and responsibility. And this is something that therapists don't recognize in the therapeutic setting. It also is very common for the abuser to resort to blaming the victim for things that never happened, which we call false accusations. This is a defensive tactic to deflect away from what they're trying to resolve. Or they'll use a grain of truth, but change the story to confuse the victim and the therapist. The abuser will continue using manipulative tactics to disrupt communication, distract attention away from themselves, and sabotage a meaningful and healthy resolution. So what this does is it places the victim on the hot seat, having to not only defend themselves, but to work much harder to clarify true facts that are playing out. So now they're being falsely accused of something that they have to explain didn't happen, and they're on the hot seat. And then they have to work extra hard at proving that and clarifying the true facts that are playing out. And this is a very common experience that plays out in therapy when you're dealing with somebody who has entrenched, strongly entrenched faulty thinking and abusive behaviors. So the victim when a victim has been in a prolonged relationship of being made responsible for all that is wrong in the relationship, they often develop post-traumatic stress disorder and become re-triggered from the recurring trauma and, quite frankly, exhausted. And so this dynamic playing out in a therapeutic setting is severely traumatizing to the victim and makes couples therapy with the abuser futile and destructive. So it actually exacerbates their trauma and makes them so weary and exhausted just going through the process. In fact, experts in the abuse arena, such as those with, like, for example, the National Domestic Violence Hotline or other organizations that focus solely on abuse, do not encourage anyone in an abusive relationship to seek counseling with their partner. Most couples therapists do not know this, however. They, your marriage and family therapists, your psychologists, your psychiatrists, most of them do not have adequate training on abuse. For example, the Board of Behavioral Sciences, which trains marriage and family therapists, and the Board of Psychology require only 10 to 15 hours of training on abuse in their entire academic studies. So they are ill-equipped to identify the confusing and manipulative behaviors and patterns of emotional abuse that also play out in the therapeutic setting. They might be able to identify that if someone is punched, it's domestic violence, but they are not equipped to identify the confusing natures of emotional abuse, overt and covert forms of abuse. And so they don't help the situation. They actually, by not identifying it and clarifying it, they're actually exacerbating the situation. Additionally, therapists adopt a number of viewpoints that results in them avoiding confronting the abuser, or avoiding confronting abusive behaviors, or naming abuse, which we will discuss further in this training. So it's like a therapeutic stance that they not confront, and we'll talk more about that. In a relationship between a victim and abuser, it's critical to understand no problem can be resolved without first addressing the abuse. There is an unequal power structure in the relationship, and until abuse is identified and named and confronted and resolved thoroughly over an extended period of time, so with a proven track record, couples therapy will be harmful to the victim. It's also not helpful to the person who's causing the harm, because without being held fully accountable and responsible, incorrect therapy actually emboldens the abuser's faulty thinking to continue to carry out destructive and manipulative behaviors. They're not being held accountable. It's not being named. It's not being confronted. So they actually feel like they're more right than the victim, and it emboldens their faulty thinking. And this will play out not only in the therapeutic setting, but they will be emboldened at home and maybe even in public. And if the therapist does not name these behaviors as destructive, this will exacerbate a victim's trauma. Also, if the abuser does not lose something they value, there is rarely motivation to change. So if the therapist doesn't say it is your fault, like no relationship can withstand these destructive behaviors. If they don't place that responsibility on them, or say, we are going to step out of couples therapy and I'm going to advise that you enter individual therapy because you need to work on your abuse. If they don't take these positions, it exacerbates and emboldens their stance. Furthermore, couples therapy can then create a dynamic that results in heightened abuse at home when the couple leaves the session. So in general, abuse escalates over time, especially if the abuser feels more empowered. So now your therapeutic setting has actually empowered the abuser because they haven't confronted the behaviors or the person. And now if this happens, the victim is not only left to deal with this heightened abuse, but they feel betrayed by the counselor, which is a highly, highly traumatic experience to face. Okay, so that's one dynamic that plays out in a therapeutic setting, but another common dynamic that plays out is the professional approach to couples therapy that treats any problem as a mutual responsibility. So you've heard it said 50-50 responsibility, 100%. Even if you hear 80-20, oh, you know, if the therapist says to the abuser, it's 80% your fault and 20% your fault to the victim, any concept of shared responsibility inevitably directs the focus on the victim's shortcomings, no matter how small they may be. This misguided approach causes significant damage to the victim while further emboldening the abuser, because the abuser will focus solely on the victim's part, no matter how small it may be. As long as there is any portion of abuse in the relationship, that's all that should be highlighted and examined in couples therapy. Now, I'm not encouraging couples therapy. I'm just saying if they are in like the early process of couples therapy before it is discerned that it is in fact an abusive situation, there should never be focus on a shortcoming of the victim. And what I'll go into later, usually the shortcomings have to do with their traumatic triggers and things, and that should not be the focus. So to not confront it properly, to do otherwise, it actually exploits the victim's vulnerabilities and places the victim in a downgraded position, which is where they live within the relationship already, and it significantly traumatizes them. So by focusing on a victim's shortcomings, it takes the entire focus off of all the abuse that has been occurring and allows everyone to focus on the victim, which is entirely unfair and it is incorrect. It is, in terms of protocol, it is an incorrect stance to take in therapy. Because what a therapist needs to do is to fully align with the victim and protect them against the dynamics of blame shifting, of focusing on the victim's minor faults, and if to not do that would actually constitute therapeutic abuse, or what we call double abuse in whatever form. It's also very difficult for the abuser. Another dynamic that plays out is that the abuser has a very difficult time to hear and accept the flaws of themselves. They will create false accusations, like I mentioned, and numerous deflections that will place the responsibility on the victim and to distract from the core issue that they're trying to resolve. So this presents an opportunity for the narcissistic abuser to focus on changing the flaws in their partner and avoid owning and taking responsibility for their harmful behaviors, ultimately creating an atmosphere where transparency, which would be healthy in a healthy couples therapy situation, where transparency, vulnerability, authenticity are all present, but now those things are not safe for the victim because the abuser will exploit those vulnerabilities. In my interviews with countless victims, the confidential information and vulnerabilities they authentically shared within the therapeutic setting were later used by the abuser to exploit, attack, or disparage the victim, both in private and publicly amongst friends. So now the therapeutic setting creates even more vulnerability and trauma, because what they divulged in their honesty in that setting is now exploited to blame them and to say they have character problems, or to place a big burden of responsibility on the victim. And so in that case, couples therapy cannot be safe if it is shared with an unsafe partner, and that's what abusers are. They are unsafe. 100% of the responsibility needs to belong to the abuser. Even if a therapist internally identifies a small percentage of responsibility on the victim, a good therapist will not bring attention to this in any way, because an abuser will solely focus on that small portion as if it is 100% of the problem. a highly traumatizing experience for the victim. In my therapeutic experience, when we have since healed our marriage, but it took years and of separation and intensive work, but my husband would invent false accusations, and that would then be the focus. And it would be highly distracting and traumatizing. And therapists repeatedly did not identify the pattern that would play out. So they're just not trained to identify these things. Professionals who specialize in abuse will be able to identify abuse early on, the 1 or 2 sessions, and they will be able to identify it and immediately advise that there be separate counselors for each partner in the relationship. Unfortunately, most couples therapists do not have this level of expertise, making the risk of double abuse very high. Now, we will talk a little bit later about how to interview for a therapist to make sure that you're in a safe place. We'll do that a little bit later. Double abuse is a term that I identified to describe the harm victims experience when they speak up and reach out for help. And in response, they are met with criticism, like I said before, incorrect instructions, judgment. It might be disbelief. I don't believe you. I can't imagine that person ever behaving the way you're describing. I've never seen that in public. They just won't believe them. Or they might just be apathetic. I don't want to get involved. I'm sorry you're going through that. I'm sure it'll all work out. They don't invest themselves in the victim and helping them. Because what a victim really needs is fully committed help, a fully committed person who will stand with them during this time when they're so vulnerable to disclose abuse. Double abuse re-traumatizes the victim, exacerbating the symptoms that they are experiencing, and can transition post-traumatic stress disorder coming from the original abuse into complex post-traumatic stress disorder, a much harder condition to heal. Complex PTSD is a diagnosis that's not yet in the DSM-5. However, it is in the ICD-11, the International Toolbook of Diagnosis. It was adopted in 2018. Now, if a therapist is not fully trained in how to identify post-traumatic stress symptoms, and if they don't know how to treat it, they will fail to recognize the signs of trauma that the victim is displaying, and they will actually misinterpret those signs. They will judge the victim wrongly, and so forth. They will also fail to understand, this is very important, the victim's susceptibility to advancing their PTSD into complex PTSD, which complex PTSD comes out of a sense of hopelessness and despair. So that may help you understand that when a victim discloses abuse and they're treated in the ways that I described double abuse is, or when their therapist doesn't fully align with them, they often, almost uniformly, develop a sense of hopelessness and despair, like there's no way out, there's no one to help me. And that hopelessness and despair, that type of exacerbation of their PTSD symptoms results in complex PTSD, which takes years to heal. It is much more severe form of trauma to heal. Another common dynamic that takes place in couples therapy is that the therapist will actually prioritize the abuser as much as the victim. This is how they are trained, that both people have an equal value in the therapeutic setting. But there can be no level of neutrality when abuse is present. There is no neutrality in abuse. If you treat the situation neutral, you are inadvertently or intentionally colluding in abuse. It is that simple. By prioritizing both individuals equally, the therapist may unknowingly participate in the abuse. Trauma is damaging. So we've just said that. PTSD can develop into CPTSD. Trauma is damaging. It causes emotional as well as physiological effects at the cellular level. It affects the endocrine system. It can cause any number of physical illnesses. And so trauma must be the priority. The victim must be the priority. hurting an abuser's feelings does not cause that person trauma. We have to treat the trauma as a priority, and that's the victim. Along the same line, therapists I've interviewed have said they're not hired to confront. The clients come in, they aren't asking me to confront. They're asking to talk about their feelings. They often tiptoe around labels, not wanting to use the word abuse or narcissistic tendencies or any phrases that will label the situation accurately. And when that is present, it's absolutely what needs to happen for abuse to be properly identified and named. The victim cannot climb their way out without precise clarity of the behaviors, the problems, and the patterns. And the abuser will never gain the clarity they need if they are not confronted honestly. Moreover, the victim needs the therapist to label the abuse and help them set strong boundaries against its tactics. And the therapist should be setting strong boundaries about abuse that they witness playing out in the session. Now, I'm not advocating couples therapy. I'm talking about in the early diagnostic stages of, 2 or 3 sessions at most with a therapist. They should not tolerate any form of abuse and they should stop it. But in the therapists that I've interviewed, I've heard just the most sometimes ridiculous responses. One therapist said, well, who's going to help the abuser if I confront the abuser? He will walk away from therapy, he said to me, if I confront his behaviors. The best thing that can happen to an abuser is for the therapist to name the abuse and to communicate to them that they are not safe for couples therapy. Abusers need to experience a breakdown before they will experience a breakthrough. And if they are rejected out of couples therapy, it's an experience that they need to reconcile with. It's a helpful experience for them to reconcile with. And they should not be worried about coddling an abuser at the expense of traumatizing the victim. Whether a breakthrough can also happen through a marital separation, which we advocate for, because it will give reprieve to the victim from recurring trauma. So any one of these kinds of breakdowns can help an abuser face into their problems. It's not guaranteed to happen. Many will walk away, but for those few that have potential to change, it's the kind of experience that needs to take place to motivate that change. Okay. Further, many therapists, not all, and we know therapists are well-intentioned. It's not intentional, but this is just a lack of expert training in the topic of abuse. Therapists often fail to recognize that a victim has been working much harder on the relationship than the abuser. And the victim is already wary and broken down, requiring unwavering support by the therapist. But when the therapist fears the abuser will leave therapy if they're confronted and wonders who's going to care for the abuser if that happens, instead of focusing on the victim's well-being is now compromised. A correct viewpoint would be to place the priority for treatment on trauma, which is what I just said, that the victim is experiencing, which is extremely emotionally and physically damaging. There's nothing wrong with an abuser leaving therapy or being asked to leave. I just want to re-emphasize that. So often we want to minimize the consequences for abusers, thinking, well, we can help that person along, when what they really need to experience, they've been getting away with this behavior for years, what they really need to experience is consequences. Consequences changes outcomes, and we have to be willing to be more bold and embrace consequences, whether you are a therapist or whether you're somebody walking alongside, a difficult couple like this. You have to be willing to allow the consequences to occur and to encourage the victim to hold boundaries and have ultimatums that will allow those consequences to occur. And it's a very hard process for victims to go through, which is even more valuable for a therapist to help them with that process, to not not to act out the same behaviors that a victim does, which is to accommodate the abuser. It's unhelpful. It's just perpetuating the cycle of abuse, and that needs to stop, particularly in therapy. So with a therapist attempting to provide a safe space for both people in couples therapy, often therapists focus much of their attention on getting the abuser to engage in the process. So this is another way, when they're focusing on both partners equally, it's now the focus really shifts to getting the abuser to engage in the process, because an abuser's affect, like their emotional, their body language and their facial expressions, don't align with the emotions that they should have. So I mentioned earlier that they lack empathy. So when it's time to express empathy, an abuser will have a different affect. It won't align. If he says, "I'm sorry," it'll be like flat. It won't be an authentic apology. And so the therapist often works to engage the abuser in the process, but it's moot because they're not ready to get to that stage. So now suddenly the focus is all on the abuser rather than on validating the victim's perspective. So the victim, the abuser gets extra effort and attention, which puts the therapist actually in alignment with the abuser, making the victim feel abandoned and unheard, creating an unsafe atmosphere for the victim. And I hope that makes sense. It's not just about expressions of empathy. It can be exploring their feelings or their childhood, or any of those things are a distraction from addressing abuse. And they don't have a place in couples therapy when abuse is present. As this alignment continues, where the therapist is aligning with the abuser, it significantly exacerbates the victim's trauma and increases their sense of hopelessness and isolation because they're not receiving that firm validation and support from the therapist. The likely unintended result is a form of double abuse, therapeutic abuse, rather than receiving the help they desperately need and deserve. When the abuser is also a narcissist, they may leave the therapy session if confronted or if being held responsible by the therapist, perhaps by walking out mid-session or after the session. The abuser may refuse to return, giving the reason that, it's not working. It's a waste of money. You're the one who needs it, not me. That therapist doesn't do it for me. I want another one. When a narcissist feels they are losing control and their image will be tainted by the process, they will likely abandon it. And this can be devastating to the victim who has put hope into the therapeutic process. This is one reason why it's so much better for the therapist to place the proper boundaries on couples therapy by refusing to partake and to find a competent referral for the abusive party. So if the therapist says it is not appropriate, it doesn't give the abuser the opportunity to exit therapy. It tells the abuser you're not appropriate for couples therapy, and that's has a much better effect on the victim from their point of view. Okay. Double abuse also occurs when the therapist is not properly trained to recognize abuse when it's present, especially covert emotional abuse. So we have overt emotional abuse, which is yelling, raging, name calling, loud put downs. Those are more easy for a victim to discern there's something seriously wrong. But covert emotional abuse are the confusing, manipulative behaviors that are difficult to identify. No matter how intelligent a victim may be, they have a hard time coming up with the emotional language to describe these manipulative behaviors. And so they're harder to identify, and therefore they're very difficult to confront. This is particularly true when the individuals do not understand they are in an abusive relationship. Many times the victim doesn't know that what they are experiencing is actually a form of domestic violence. They just think they're in a complicated relationship. And so the victim is often in what I call a prolonged state of stressful confusion, which is a trauma state of constant recurring trauma. So a prolonged state of stressful confusion, which can go on for months or many years without them being able to discern what is happening. And if you join our training that we're going to be doing next week, our introductory training will go more deeply into covert emotional abuse and describe these behaviors, and you'll understand how and why it can actually extend for years without them being able to identify what is happening. Therapists easily, when there is covert emotional abuse present, therapists easily get caught up in the minutia of each complaint without recognizing the covert abusive behaviors or patterns that are regularly playing out in the relationship. So I mentioned to you that my husband used to do false accusations, and then I would have to explain why that never was true, and the therapist will go, well, why did you leave the restaurant? And I'd have to say, I didn't leave the restaurant. This is not an accurate depiction. That never happened. And they get stuck in the minutia, wanting to talk about those details rather than recognizing, well, you falsely accused her last week of something else. There's a false accusation this week. There is a pattern of false accusations. That's what needs to be identified. And sadly, if therapists are not trained to identify the specific behaviors of covert emotional abuse, they don't address the patterns that are playing out. And they get stuck in the minutia, like I said, and it just is very exacerbating of trauma. It feels absolutely hopeless. You're getting nowhere, and you're being on the hot seat week after, the victim's on the hot seat week after week. So abuse could be challenging to identify, as abusers are often charming, and they're well-spoken, and they present themselves calm and collected to outsiders, whereas a traumatized victim often presents as scattered, fragmented thinking. They have a hard time recalling exactly what happened. Because of the trauma, they have like temporary amnesia. All kinds of things can happen. They have uncontrollable shaking, which the therapist should be astute enough to pick up on those signals. The victim will show signs of confusion, low self-worth. They may be highly frustrated. All of these things can lead the victim to appearing, crazy. I don't mean that literally, but out of sorts. And therapists who are not trained to recognize post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma, they judge these traumatic symptoms as someone who is too angry, too sad, too numb, too accommodating of the abuser, or too rigid or detached. And they may identify the victim then as the primary problem, when those are just symptoms of the primary problem. And this often leads the therapist to placing the victim at fault, where they absolutely do not belong, while the abuser's account and distorted feelings are nurtured. A serious form of double abuse. This is a serious form of double abuse, which can escalate PTSD symptoms into complex PTSD. And this is very sad when you consider that a therapist has the ability to escalate PTSD into complex PTSD because they aren't trained to identify trauma and to serve trauma. So it's really, really important that a victim seeks a trauma-informed and trauma-trained therapist. So another problem that plays out is that therapists often focus on feelings, and they rarely confront faulty thinking or destructive behaviors. The three pillars that describe an abusive person are faulty belief system, image management, and entitlement. Now, a faulty belief system might be a faith point of view that believes that men are in a hierarchical position, so patriarchy. And therapists don't normally confront belief systems. And that creates a significant problem, because for an abuser, their faulty thinking needs to be unpacked thoroughly over an extended period of time before there's going to be any signs of change. Another problem or pillar is image management. They act one way at home, but they work extra hard to appear very different in public. They serve the community. They volunteer at church. They are pillars in their work environment, and they're exalted in their work environment, and so they appear to have it all together, and they work really hard at that image management while they act very differently at home. They might say things to undermine their spouse, or they might say things to really compliment their spouse, so they appear like they're just such a great husband or wife. And so people are much less apt to believe when a victim comes forward that abuse is actually taking place. And then the last pillar is entitlement. They believe that double standards are appropriate, that they deserve better treatment than their spouse, and that that's acceptable. These pillars are about faulty thinking ideals, and they need to be unpacked and challenged thoroughly in individual therapy before the abuser's distorted feelings should be addressed. In an early session, well, let me just say that a qualified abuse counselor doesn't address, and in all the successful abuse books that are on the market, it will say the same thing, that their thinking needs to be addressed before any feelings are touched on. It needs to be unpacked. And that is just a chronic mistake that happens in therapy, is addressing what are actually distorted feelings in the abuser, because they don't have healthy feelings and emotions. So it's a waste of time. Their faulty thinking needs to be unpacked. In an early session before separating the couple into individual therapy, both individuals benefit by having destructive behaviors and faulty thinking confronted by the therapist. So I'm going to move quickly because we're running out of time. Confronting communicates to the abuser that abusive tactics that they're employing are their sole responsibility and they need to change. This is non-negotiable. It also shows both parties that confronting is the appropriate response to the abuse by the victim. So the victim needs to have that role modeled. It's helpful for a therapist to actually role model and even with both parties present, and maybe even hold up their hand as to show how firm they can really be. I will not tolerate this discussion until you get back on topic. I'm not going to have you blame shift, turn this around on me, and distract from what we're trying to resolve. And if you can't do that, this conversation is over, and really putting a firm boundary. This empowers the victim to find and use their voice, and it shows them that it's like, particularly if they're part of a faith-based community, that it's not an unfeminine or inappropriate use of their voice to be firm. And it shows the abuser that it's also appropriate to be treated as firmly as that, which is very helpful for the therapist to demonstrate with both parties present. By focusing on feelings rather than confronting behaviors, the therapist allows the abuser to avoid personal accountability. The only feelings that should be addressed are those of the victims. So that is okay to talk about the victim's feelings, but not about the abuser's feelings. Let's see. I'm going to skip that because we talked about that. When emotional or physical abuse is present in a relationship, experts recommend that victims leave the relationship to guard them against recurring trauma, or to embark on what is called a controlled separation, where, so we're saying to either leave this relationship entirely or embark on a controlled separation where terms of the separation are outlined firmly in a contract that each party agrees to abide by. Now, we talk about controlled separation at length in our comprehensive training, which you can learn about by visiting our website. The couple can have a first or second meeting with the therapist together and then proceed with qualified individual therapy. In individual therapy, the abuser would sign a waiver allowing the victim to communicate with the abuser's therapist in order to provide details about what events are transpiring in real time. This supports full transparency for the abuser's therapist, with the objective to confront the abuser about the overt and covert behaviors that are playing out, and to require that the abuser own their behaviors and make reparations to the victim in real time with the support of their therapist. So the abuser may really not like to do that, but the therapist will be encouraging that and requiring that of them. That would be healthy individual therapy where both parties are like in a collaborative situation. And simultaneously, the victim can benefit greatly from an experienced therapist who fully understands trauma and the effects of recurring trauma and who is fully aligned with the victim to be able to validate their experiences and feelings, build a new sense of self-worth, encourage setting boundaries, and very importantly, to stand firmly with them without placing any blame or responsibility on the victim, because it gets very difficult when they set boundaries and the abuser wants to crash those boundaries. Then the victim has to actually carry through with ultimatums, which creates sometimes even more chaos. But so oftentimes more trauma occurs, but they need to go through that process in order to really hold firm to the abuser and not allow abusive behaviors to continue. It's just a difficult process that they really need therapeutic support. And once individual therapy goes on for a couple of years, and it literally takes a couple of years, and both are really doing the work on themselves, then they can come back to couples therapy to talk about reunification or possibly reconciliation. And at this point, regardless of how the abuser feels though, the victim knows best whether they can withstand a reconciliation and whether the victim must, the victim must be the one that makes that determination, whether they're willing or ready. And there should be no pressure from outside forces that they should reconcile. Trauma is measurable and it is very difficult to overcome. So the victim's desire and their capacity, their resiliency for trauma needs to be the priority, whether they're going to resume that therapy. So I'd like to now make a couple of notes for churches. We believe pastors, church staff, and lay leaders have the best intentions and good hearts wanting to help those that they come alongside. Yet we have found that if not unanimously, they almost unanimously refer difficult couples to couples therapy. So when a pastor tells a victim, now we know couples therapy is contraindicated. It is not advisable. And if there's a difficult couple that's been in therapy for years, it's a red flag that there likely is abuse going on. Even though that may be the last thing that you suspect, you need to heighten your point of view that that very likely could be the problem. And when a pastor tells a victim that they need to be in couples therapy rather than to separate from the abuser and to be in their own individual therapy, the pastor communicates to the victim that their trauma doesn't matter, even if that message is unintentional. So to pastors, oftentimes the marriage union is the priority rather than the well-being of the victim and the children inside that marriage. And that is a mistake. We need to focus on the trauma as the priority. And in cases where they're encouraged to be in couples therapy, now it's placing responsibility on the victim to hold the marriage together rather than giving them the freedom to take the steps they need to separate themselves from the trauma so that they can heal, which is the only real path to a healthy reconciliation. I believe that churches need to screen their therapists who are trained specifically in abuse and trauma and require them to participate in a comprehensive MEND training to establish protocols for interfacing with complicated couples. When abuse is suspected, the best thing a pastor can do is realize they are not an expert and refer a couple out to a trauma-trained therapist who specializes in abuse. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information and we're out of time, but before we wrap up with Q&A, for those who'd like to stay for Q&A, I just want to refer you to our website. We have various resources on our website. We even have a blog that we posted a while back on how to interview for a therapist that you can access. These relationships are very difficult to understand, and our website is full of resources to simplify the complicated nature of emotional abuse. Our website brings clarity to victims, it brings tools for them to advocate for themselves, and it brings clarity to abusers, And there are comprehensive tools for first responders so that they interface with victims in a more compassionate and understanding way. It's very specific, so it's easy to understand, and we just really encourage you to tap into that. If you'd like to learn more about covert emotional abuse and double abuse, as well as ways to interface correctly with victims and abusers, we invite you to register to our introductory training that I mentioned earlier via Zoom next week. It's a 4-hour training completed over 2 days, next Thursday and Friday, February 4th and 5th from 10 to noon Pacific Standard Time each day. During this training, our team takes a deeper dive into defining what covert emotional abuse is, naming its specific behaviors and tactics with terms and definitions, learning how to identify it and how to respond to it. We also uncover the harms that double abuse causes and teaches you ways to prevent that. We're also getting very close to launching our comprehensive curriculum, which is a 7-day session training that goes into great depth on the topics that we've touched on in our introductory training and in this, the points that I've mentioned in this intensive today, and so much more. So we hope you'll look into that. So now, Jill, question time.
Yes, Annette, thank you so much. I know that was so much information, but you covered it so well, and I'm just so thankful for everybody who's
thank you.
Yeah, we have a comment that says, this is so wonderful. Thank you so much. And I intend to take a more in-depth training ASAP. So we're just getting good feedback.
Great. Thank you.
It's a lot of really good information. Lots of thank yous. So
thank you, everyone.
Yeah, so we're going to transition into Q&A time. If you'd like to stay on, we'd love to have you. And if you want to pop questions into the chat, I can go ahead and field those questions and ask Annette so that your questions can be answered. So we have a handful already here, Annette. So I'll start with the first one. So whether or not the therapist should use the word abuse or abuser early in the process, what are your thoughts about that from the therapist perspective, and then how it impacts the victim?
That's a great question that I should have covered in this. Like I said, oftentimes couples don't realize that they're what is the problem is domestic violence. So it can be too abrupt to say, this is abusive, or you're an abuser, or I believe that early in the process, it's important to say this is destructive behavior. And then you could say, this behavior is actually, you could say it's abusive, but I wouldn't say you're an abuser or your situation is domestic violence, because I would wait till you are with the individual, the victim alone. And on our website, we have terms and definitions that describe multiple confusing behaviors. And I recommend that you sit down with the victim and have them go through that list and really try to identify all the ways that they've been abused. And slowly then on their own, occasionally we'll have the word, it doesn't say abusive behaviors at the top of the list. It's more subtle ways that the victim from a wellspring inside themselves will be able to say, oh my goodness, I'm dealing with a much bigger problem than I thought. This is abusive. Because if you shock them initially, I call that over confronting a victim. We don't want to over confront them, but we don't want to under inform them. So we want to lead them to the information in their own time. But if we just abruptly come out with that, they both may leave therapy. It just may seem they just might be too far away from being able to grasp that concept. So we want to gently take them to that place. But it is okay to call a behavior abusive, because you're not calling the abuser an abuser. You are saying that a specific behavior is abusive. So it's not labeling the person, you're just identifying a single behavior. It is okay to do that. I hope that answers your question.
That was great. And kind of along the same lines, a question came in via Facebook, and it says, if I have a couple who comes to me for help, who I know should be doing therapy separately due to a situation of abuse, what should I do? So how do I recommend separate therapy? Or maybe, like you said, how do I have that individual one-on-one with the victim without causing more harm to the victim? Or if I have that fear that the abuser might not take the separation well, like what's a way you would recommend to do that?
I think I would I would recommend that you label, that you say, I've witnessed a series of abusive behaviors play out in the therapeutic setting, specifically this, that, that. And I feel that what is best for you at this time is that you have your own individual therapist that will work on those things with you, and that I stay with the victim, and I might not call her a victim, but whoever that is, if it's, I don't know if it's male or female, but to support the victim by saying, I'm here to be your therapist, because I can't, it's too complex to treat both of you at one time. And that I recommend that we have collaborative therapy, and just state it. And then, or you could ask for an private, an individual session with the victim alone, but oftentimes that raises red flags, and the abuser doesn't want, they feel like they're being maligned. So I really just think honesty is the best approach. And or you could this, I've seen this process work as well, where you ask the victim to write a letter. What is it like to be married to my husband or my wife? The good, bad, and the ugly. And you have them spell out the things that you know they've been trying to communicate in therapy that are abusive tendencies. And then you spend time with the abuser going through that letter in a separate session, and you tell the victim, I'm going to go through this letter now with the abuser, and we'll try to come up with a response. And at that time, you tell the abuser that you believe that they would benefit from individual therapy. That way, they're not the first one being separated out of the therapy. You're actually with them individually first, and then you can go back to the victim. So those are a couple options.
Great. We got 2 comments on that, and I just want to share with you. One is saying that this is a great approach. I feel sometimes we are too quick to label. And then another comment was, just wanted to comment that this is an excellent training, and thank you so much. So
thank you. Thank
for the
you.
feedback, both of you. We do have a couple more questions.
Sure.
So let me get to those. Okay. Sometimes victims aren't sure if the conflict or issues in their relationships are abuse, so they might innocently go to couples therapy for help. Since they aren't calling it abuse, and maybe it's not immediately clear to the therapist that there's abuse, what would you expect a good couples therapist to do if they start to see behavior that might point to emotional abuse?
Well, I think I just covered that. I think that letter is a really good way to get things written in paper, because oftentimes what we just talked about in this training is how chaotic couples therapy can become when there's an abuser present. All the deflections, the distractions, the defensive posturing, the false accusations, all of that just creates chaos, and it doesn't get anywhere. So sometimes it's really helpful if you recognize that one is being victimized, that you ask that person to write out that letter and then sit down and work with them on that. But I'm not opposed to saying, when you see a behavior that's minimizing, when you see the person say, oh, you're too sensitive, or any kind of, or making a joke at them, that at their expense, that's not a joke that everyone can laugh at, but that's at the victim's expense, that you call out the behavior specifically and say, you know, that's actually really destructive in a relationship, because any one of those behaviors repeated in a pattern is enough to be destructive, and it deserves to be called out. But it's a delicate dance, but you definitely just need to have the courage to say, this is what I recommend for you. They may both walk away from therapy, but at least you've planted the seed in the victim's mind that you are on their side, and that they have a safe place to come back to if they can find their way back to you. I would rather leave them with that impression, and to leave the abuser with the impression that he or she is not in a place healthy enough and safe enough for couples therapy, I would rather leave them with those accurate impressions than to prolong couples therapy when they're not good candidates for that.
Absolutely. And you also touched on the list of terms and definitions, the handouts we provide on our website. And that's a great resource that you touched on. So I want to refer back to the website for that resource. And also, if you need something or if you have a question, you can reach out to us at info@themendproject.com and we can help guide you to those resources as well. So one more question, it looks like here, and then we'll wrap up. So, and again, we might have kind of touched on these, but let's address it anyway. When is it ever okay to do couples therapy? It seems to me at some point that you both need to be in therapy together. And then also, what if you start with individual therapy? How can you know that that therapist is well trained in abuse if you suspect your partner is an abuser?
Well, you absolutely need to do your research. You are the client, you're the customer, you get to go shopping for therapists. So if I believe that I was a victim in the situation, I would go shopping for therapists. And when I felt that I would ask questions, and believe me, you will get red flags will come up if that person's not right for you. If you feel any discomfort with their answers, then I would move on. There's somebody else who's more equipped. I would ask for referrals. I would do an interview process so that you can determine who's really trauma informed for the victim side and who's really willing to confront and who's willing to engage in a situation where the abuser will sign a release allowing the victim to have access to the therapist to describe the current events of what are happening so that those events can be confronted, and also that therapist will collaborate, will talk to your therapist if you need help. I personally I think that gets a little bit confusing at times. A lot of people do recommend that. I think if you just have a strong enough voice and you're allowed to email the therapist and say, this is what happened this week, and lay it out, then the therapist will at least have real-time information that'll be accurate and can confront and talk about that situation with the abuser. Did I answer the question, or did I?
You did. And I think, yeah, you did. And I think what I love about that answer that you gave, Annette, is I think so many times we forget that we're in the position that we're interviewing our therapist. We get to decide who's going to talk to us, who we trust, who we feel comfortable with. And so I love that you empower that thought, equip us with that thought. So
I interviewed 11 therapists before I chose the one.
Awesome.
So don't be bashful. Just be firm. Know what you're looking for. If you need questions to ask therapists, you can go to, we have blogs that are on, past blogs that are on our website, and there is one on this topic.
So we got a couple of comments, Annette, that I want to address real quick, and they just came in. One says, I experienced clients who are victims with PTSD who are screaming. The abusers are calm. I was wondering if you could touch on that.
Mm-hmm. It's so common. I mean, I have to say, back years ago when I was in that place, you know, the therapist would say, but Annette, you're so angry. I was so frustrated because the patterns were not being identified. It was not being confronted. And my husband never appeared rattled. He was just almost sedentary, just completely calm. And I was the one that was involuntarily shaking and so frustrated. Because when you are going through so much abuse at home, and then you are so hopeful that you're in an environment seeking help with a therapist, and they are not validating you and intervening on your behalf and stopping the trauma, stopping the baloney that is being played out, the false accusations, the distractions, the mischaracterizations, and all the things that take place. If that therapist is not fully aligning, it is it's just a doubly abusive situation that no victim should have to endure. They need to be separated out of couples therapy so that the victim can heal. Every domestic violence agency knows that couples therapy is wrong, even though it's not listed in board protocols as incorrect. I believe they are outdated and inaccurate. Abuse experts working in the trenches fully recognize that it is not helpful and that it's actually harmful.
So we have one last comment and then we can wrap it up. And I am so thankful for this comment. It says, from my years of abuse, which was in a marriage, then from paternalism, i.e. church and my children taught to do so also. It's very complex. I hope to find a good therapist to speak with about these complexities and how to help us. They blame me, exclamation point. You can feel that because we hear that a lot. So your correct perspective is precious to me, Annette. That's to you. I'm 65 and this went on half of my life. I'm strong and free the last 3 years. Finally, hallelujah.
Mm.
So good.
God bless you. Oh, it's so hard. I'm glad you're strong and free. And I do hope that you are strong enough to interview therapists. You can often get your first session for free as a consultation, and that you have clarity of mind, and maybe even show the therapist our website and see what they understand and what they believe about that, and then move forward accordingly. And I just wish you the very best.
So we're through all the questions. We're ready to wrap up.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Join us again next week.
Yes, we're happy to have you with us. And thanks for all your participation today and your questions and comments. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.